to the value when the cycle began. In early 2006, the market perception of where the freight were heading was very, very negative. And as I'll explain in detail later, you would see that the Baltic Freight Forward Assessment, which is an expression of common market wisdom, was estimating that the average of the 4 routes of Capesize in 2008 would be ranging somewhere at the level of below $20,000. As you will see later, the average in 2008 so far has been to the tune of $120,000, which is about 6-fold underestimation. So much for the value of complicated and detailed forecasts. The market in late 2007 managed to reach 11,000, or 5-fold of the value at the beginning of the cycle. And then, for reasons that I explain later, was followed by a crash that brought it back to the level of 6,000, and most recently reached all-time records in May, closing at 11,500. And the last 3 months, I guess those of you who are concerned with the freight market, everybody knows what's happening. The market right now is essentially a nosedive, and as of last night, the BDI was closing at mid-6,000. So what's next? Are we going to see the next rally, a soft landing, or another crash? And that's what we're going to try to discuss. Okay, let's discuss for a second the impact that the credit crunch potentially might have on the shipping market. Essentially, its impact is going to be in the mid to long term, not a short term, and it's going to affect the shipping markets in 2 areas, in the demand side and in the supply side. Surprisingly, the credit crunch works very well for dry bulk freight on the supply side. Now, this is because the negative investment sentiment, the higher risk premiums, eliminated a number of deals related to new buildings that would have gotten financed as recently as 10 months ago. The IPO activity in the shipping sector has effectively been brought to a halt. Now, on the demand side, at least until now, the effect is not that obvious. This is because the net effect of the US-bound exports from China represents, the US-bound Chinese exports represents about 20% of the Chinese economy as a whole. So at least until now, the effect was minimal, but if you look at the 5-year tendency or 5-year correlation between the US economy as measured by S&P 500 and BDI, clearly you can see some kind of a correlation. So I submit that if we are to be faced with a protracted recession in the US and in Europe, that correlation will follow in the opposite direction as well. Looking at the last 12 months, zooming in, one could argue that there is a short-term correlation as well. I believe that this correlation in the last 12 months is just a matter of accident. As I explain later, the key drivers of the dynamics of the shipping market in 2008, those were driven almost entirely by the factors that lie outside of the influence of the US and European economy. This is further exemplified by the freight market as measured by sale and purchase assessment. Essentially, from the time when the credit crunch set in, the values of ships experienced nothing but meteoric rise. Looking at the value of a 5-year-old Cape ship, at the beginning of the credit crunch, it will cost you, if you wanted to buy one, $110 million. 3 months later, the same vessel will cost you $150 million. There was a short-term lift, a short-lived decline in January and February that brought the values to $140 million, but essentially Since then, the market recovered and stayed again at 150 million level. So let's go to forecasting the markets. As I said, my mental capacity has been affected by volatility, so I just want to make sure that I'm not losing the track of my thoughts. For reasons that I will explain later, I would submit that forecasting the markets, the dry bulk freight markets, has at best very limited value. And the long-term best approach is, the best long-term approach is try to dollar average the cost of the freight rather than try to beat the market, because if we happen to call the market right, chances are it will have as much to do with pure luck as with our wisdom. So essentially, if we apply the dollar cost average approach, chances are we will not beat the market, but we are not going to face a roller coaster ride from the perspective of the organization that you may manage. You are going to be in a better position to manage the cash flows effectively. Now it's always easier to talk about market with the benefit of the hindsight. And one could argue that it would have been indeed a more effective decision not to use a balanced approach, but go 100% with hedging back in 2005. As I mentioned earlier, chances are you would have beaten the market by about 40. If you were to work in the Cape sector, you would have beaten the average over the last 3 years by $40,000. If you were to use that approach at the beginning of the year, you would still be better off, although the effect, chances are, would not be as spectacular as it would have been had you gone long in 2005. So let's talk for a second, what are the chief reasons behind the volatility of the market and behind the rather dismal record of success behind its forecast. The reason lie in the laws of supply and demand that govern the tramp shipping, that adopt hockey stick economics. They are called hockey stick economics because the supply curve is shaped like a hockey stick. And essentially, the freight levels or the supply is perfectly elastic as long as there is a sufficient number of vessels being laid up that can be employed in the market at anything above marginal operating cost, marginal variable operating cost less the layup cost. The situation changes dramatically when the market reaches the stage of critical shortage, that is, there are no more ships that are laid up. When we have that situation that took place in 2003, the supply curve rapidly moves from the perfectly elastic region into a perfectly inelastic region. And that, combined with the rather inelastic demand, results in spectacular changes of the freight levels in a very short time frame, as we have witnessed over the last 5 to 6 years. Oops. So perhaps instead of spending too much time in going into details of the key freight market dynamics in 2008, let's just examine essentially what happened with the market. Oops. After reaching a 3-year high in November 2007,